Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event. I'm Eric Gilbert, the director of Rain Taxi. If you don't know about us, we are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature. Our work revolves around a quarterly magazine of critical writing. This is our new issue. I'd love to mail you a copy. Check out our website anytime after tonight's event if you're interested, or if you're interested in becoming a member, you'll get all our issues sent to your mailbox as well. Another way we advocate for literature is through events like this one. Tonight's event, like most of ours, is free. But if you're able to pitch in a little something, please feel free to use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Rain Taxi is privileged to receive funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, among other funders, but our most vital supporters are individuals like you. There are many other ways you can participate tonight. A lot of you are already chiming in the chat, and that is great. I see guests from all the way from Japan and Italy and many other places around the globe. There's also the Ask a Question box, and if you have a question for Charles tonight, by all means, please put it there, and we're going to get to some of those at the very end of the performance. And then, of course, maybe the best button of all is buy the book. And if you hit that button tonight, you'll be taken to the page for Topsy-Turvy at our partner bookseller, Majors and Quinn, here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If there are other books on your wish list, books by Charles, books by Tanya, books by any other great poets out there, you can just poke around on their site, and anything you purchase through Majors and Quinn does help support this very series. That's about all the stuff you need to know in terms of what's happening on screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce these wonderful people. What do you say about a literary giant like Charles Bernstein? I'm going to leave the official biography behind. You know all the awards and the history. I'll just say that I feel like Charles's CV could be turned into a great Broadway musical someday, so I hope somebody gets on that. Charles has one of the most powerful intellects in poetics and one of the most playful voices in verse, and fortunately for all of us readers, it's a winning combination. His newest book, the one we're celebrating tonight, Topsy-Turvy, what a bullseye descriptor for our current moment. It's a book that travels far and wide in a dizzying array of forms and colors. And to help serve as our tour guide tonight, we are blessed to have with us Tanya M Foster. A few years back, Tanya published a poetry collection that blew everyone away called A Swarm of Bees in High Court. And I hear there's another book on the way. Very excited about that. She's also the co-editor with Kristen Prevelet of one of my favorite books of the century, the essay collection Third Mind, Creative Writing Through Visual Art. She's coming to us today from San Francisco, so we have kind of an East meets West thing happening here. I'm going to get out of the way so these brilliant poets can turn us all upside down and hopefully right side up again before the end. Thank you both for being here, and now the mic is in your high court.
Well, thanks so much, Eric. It's great to do this. I wish I was in Minneapolis in person, but this is the next best thing. And I so much appreciate what Rain Taxi does, giving response to really probably thousands of books over the decades that you've been doing it, reviews and of course the work in Minneapolis. It's great to be here with my friend Tanya. We talk all the time on the phone, actually, more than email. And so I thought the ideal person to continue that conversation with. And she was from New York, and then she moved to the Bay Area. I believe that I'm coming from Brooklyn, and I think she's coming from Oakland.
Yes.
So those are the places. And well, thanks for joining me, Tanya. You have in mind, you wrote me to play a little bit of this clip from. Explain that, and I think
it's something. I was thinking about the title of your book. I kept turning it over, and one of the things I decided was, I decided to look up, where does this title come from, this term, Topsy-Turvy? And I ran across this Mike Leigh film called Topsy-Turvy about Gilbert and Sullivan. And I just liked if you could play a clip of the trailer.
I'm playing this starting at 1:45, and you tell me when to stop.
Okay.
Comes a story of inspiration.
3 little maids from school are we.
Collaboration.
I should like to thank you all most passionately for your tremendous hard work and application.
And the magic that happens.
You light up the world. You can't help it.
When the world is turned upside down.
Something inherently disappointing about success.
So we can stop.
Just gonna play the whole thing. Like Frank Zappa would just play the clip over and over. I love this film. The movie is not really relevant, particularly to the book, but still, it's the title.
Well, it's interesting you say that. It is, because even when I haven't seen the film yet, but I've been looking for since I found it.
Oh, what?
What's happening?
I'm going topsy-turvy. Oh, there. Oh.
Well,
yeah, now this is the way this is my normal state.
That's the way you are.
See me. This is the way I see the world. Yeah. And no, I love Gilbert and Sullivan. And actually, I've been watching a lot of Mike Leigh during this COVID period. He's a fantastic filmmaker with a lot of dark dramas of working class England, and also his Turner film. But Topsy-Turvy itself is a little bit different, but
also the relationship between the composer and the writer. That there's something of that in this book, where there's that incredible mixture of songs and poetry. There's always that push in poetry towards song sometimes, and there's a tension here in that. There's also collaborations, just in terms of there are so many references to poets and people, and it seems like ongoing conversations with them.
Music to my ears, like they say. There's a lot of yes. I think of it as a musical. I'm really interested in Gilbert and Sullivan and the operetta because of it's satiric. I think there's a lot of ways in which Gilbert and Sullivan seems a little too Victorian for my taste nowadays, going through a lot of musical after that. But there's a lot of connection there. And there are many connections with that name, Topsy-Turvy. I was originally going to call this book something different. I put it together in March, just when the COVID restrictions, shelter in place started. I thought, well, I'm going to spend my time putting together this book, which I wouldn't have done right away. And initially, I was going to call it The Joker, with the O with a slash mark through it, so kind of like the Norwegian ruin. And Susan B, who's painting this in back of me there, had a painting called The Joker, with a Joker card, and that would have been a perfect cover. But then there was the big commercial movie that came out, even bigger at that time than Topsy-Turvy is, and I didn't want to make it a reference to that movie, which I haven't seen. And also, I became less interested in that title, by the way. So I didn't, but I was searching around for something, and then Topsy-Turvy hit me. And Topsy-Turvy, is the first poem. I've asked you to pick the poems. It's very generous of you to do that. Pick a couple of poems for me to read. One of them,
and us to discuss.
So they're your selection, and then I asked you, and you generously have agreed to read a poem of yours, which I think very much connects up with it. So the first poem you asked me to read, which I will in a second, is called Errata. So Errata is also an experience of Topsy-Turvy. I have a kind of topsy-turvy cognitive experience often. I reverse things a lot. I go left when I should go right. I confuse names. So the experience of being upside down is one that's a cognitive one for me, as well as, anybody reading this book, I don't even remember what the originals are myself. I call it echoes and echo poetics. I constantly substitute one word for another or reverse common expressions or turn them backward and try to create kind of music and rhythm with that. But yes, it is kind of an operetta or oratorio, maybe, or musical of many different kinds of song, and actually song form. Of course, you're right. I haven't talked about that much because the book is new, but there are a lot of things that are very specifically related to song form. Well, often they're kind of distorted and demented, but not this one. Let me start then to read the first one, and we can cue this up. We're going to show the text for this called Errata. And there it is. Oh, I just can read it right from the screen. It's so big. I thought I should be reading it from my book because you want to see.
The book. Well, I can hold up the book.
Hold up our book and put it over my face, but I think I'll actually read it from the screen so I can look straight at the camera. Oh, that's too close. For red, read, I should not have done it. Should have left it alone. I don't know what came over me or why I could not try as I might overcome it. For oceanic, read leeward, as when the ball dribbles its way to the center of the earth and the heart barely hears its own beat, but never fails to heed yours. For lard, read a studied casualness that disguises genuine casualness. For incandescent, read drowned in love's apposite fortune, leering at gushes in the gust of a fragrance. For thimbled, read record-breaking heat, reducing statutes to mud, puddles, and ideas to pruning hooks. For cyclic, read swollen. For brush briskly for 5 minutes with capon minder, read off limits. For crustacean, read crustacean. For you be my gracious refuge now, song, read why do you rouse my soul and stir up the past? Be merciful, desist, let the embers of my joy be. For demonic dispossession, read season of mist and mellow fruitfulness.
It's funny, you read it as fruitfulness and it's fruitlessness.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Right?
Errata.
Errata in a reading of the errata.
Read season of mist and mellow fruitlessness. Of course, I changed the quote, and but when I read back the more familiar version to me. But definitely season of mist and mellow fruitlessness. But there's an example of reversal itself, fruitlessness, and you hear, even you hear, of course, because of the poem, but you hear the fruit.
Yes, I mean, there's
anyway,
something...
even though you have fruitless, I love that's the chordal relationship, and I just did it myself. No matter if you change it, you still hear the other part. If you know even if you don't know the poem, you know the.
Right.
You assume that it's going to be fruitfulness. I think we can take this text off the. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, there's something really. As I was reading this, and I don't know, with your work, often it's so often, in my experience of it, reflective, right, and reflexive. That it's reflecting on the very process of its own saying. Its own being, and that's both the joy, but it's also the kind of moment of a grief, right? There's a certain kind of melancholy in that seeing oneself saying, and so I was thinking about, as I was reading this, and then I'm like, okay, this is what, Charles? This is your 19th book of full collection of poetry, and this is not including the essay collections, the translations, the edited volumes. And I was thinking, wow.
I haven't counted, but yeah, I mean, I could.
Well, I began counting, and I thought, And so I thought of that. And then I thought of an Austrian therapist I once had who said to me, "Your issues are always your issues." And
Your
I'm like,
issues, Tanya, are always your issues.
are
We have to get
always your
over these
issues.
issues so that we can get on to new issues.
So issues are always your issues. And I was thinking as I was reading your first volume, Asylums,
Wow,
and thinking,
1974 and 75.
right, that if you had to track your issues, what do you carry with you from Asylum to Topsy-Turvy?
Mm. Well, that's a wonderful question, which I am will have to leave to you, the readers, to figure out. I am obsessed with having lots of variety and change, even in the bad sense of variety. I mean, it's not bad to me, but in the sense of vaudeville, a variety show, you
Mhm.
bring on a different act. You have the comedian, you have the torch singer, acrobatic act. I mean, that actually Topsy-Turvy is structured that way in some
Mhm.
sense. Slapstick, verbal comedian. Um, so at one point in an early book, relatively early, of shorter sort of poems that felt more lyric, which was called, probably, it was Stigma. Well, actually, also an Irving Goffman title, like Asylum. Um, the blurb for that was characteristically uncharacteristic. So this aesthetic of having books that are characteristically uncharacteristic is indeed characteristic. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm doing it. It's not, for me, it's not unusual. And actually, that's a problem too. I try to push against that. And I think that Topsy-Turvy, along with a couple of other books, really have the kind of maximum variation. However, Topsy-Turvy was, unlike many of my books, was written over maybe the last 2 years before it came out. Most of the poems, not all of them. A lot of times
That's
I
what I
go
was
back
going to
10 years.
ask.
So the variety had to do with ones that I actually came up with in that period of time. So, I mean, Asylum, that first book, which was done on a manual typewriter, and it was Xeroxed with staples on the side, maybe 40 copies that were circulated to a few friends. It's been reproduced, so you can see it on the Eclipse site. But that book had several entirely different kinds of poems. And that's one of the things, and I called it Asylum's Press. That was the name of the Press of Asylum. So Asylum, in this sense, was not only an insane asylum, which is what the
Right.
Kaufman book is, but an asylum
Or
and
refuge.
a sanctuary. Right. Refuge, but sanctuary and refuge. And actually, I'm really interested in those two terms, the difference between refugee, let's say, and also sanction and sanctuary also is a very interesting difference. You take sanction on somebody, but you create a sanctuary. But I'm interested in Asylum as what the space of a poem is, but also in that book they were little separate worlds that joggled next to each other, but they didn't coincide. The title poem, is all taken from Irving Goffman's book Asylum, which was discussions of mental institutions, prisons, monasteries, closed worlds, and it was sampled from that. But each thing, I called the book Asylums, plural, and the press with an apostrophe. Each would be a separate world. So I think with Topsy-Turvy, you can see a lot of those interests are in common. So I mean, going back to read Errata, I don't really know why did you pick Errata in respect to this when you're reading through the book?
I think part of it for me was the process of reading aloud, that I was interested in the way this text is about a performance of reading aloud. And even with the first phrase for read, read, I said, is it for read? I should not have done it, should have left it alone. That I was excited by that and interested in that, and think that it speaks to your impulse to read how we're reading.
I mean, that errata form, which I always errata slips. It would be for read, read, and actually, it's kind of a tongue for my cognitive displacements. It can be a tongue twister for read, read, read. But read and reader are fascinating. R-E-D and R-E-A-D, and those three different homophones are there's a world in those, of course, with color. But the whole idea of correction, errata and correction, is a little bit goes back to asylum too, because asylum, to be corrected constantly in the world, which sometimes is necessary. And by the way, I genuinely do not like to go in the wrong direction. I'm helpful if somebody corrects it. Recalculating is another image like that. But nonetheless, the errancy, I lately like the title for myself as poet/errant, like in John Quixote, knight errant, poet errant, which means, of course, wandering, but it's as an office in a way. The poet errant is the opposite of the poet laureate. And but error is something that is real for me. It isn't just an abstraction. It's I'm very conscious of, and we all are, but it's something I'm immersed in and think a lot about. But of course, in that particular poem, it's all about substitution or metaphor. So one thing replaces the other, and they do connect up. It becomes a kind of a manic thing where it's a machine where one replaces the other. It's a kind of an anti-Bachelor machine, I sometimes call those, a kind of anti-Duchampian, because a Bachelor machine in Duchamp is non-procreative machine, a machine that doesn't have any. And I think of them as also anti-Bachelor machines in the sense that they produce aesthetic space, but they're substitutions that allow for leaps of the imagination, which can be done safely in a poem. Do not try this outside of the poem, but in the poem you can make those leaps and hear what they are. And even in reading it, it's very funny that in a poem called Errata, I read the line wrong, thinking of the original poem.
It's something. It makes me think of an exchange we had via text message yesterday, and I was saying how there's a rejection of use value in your work, but there is not a wholesale rejection of meaning in your work. And so that there's some way that in the middle of the play, for me, like I had a very hard time choosing which poems, in part because there are so many that I loved, and I thought, well, we could spend, for instance, you have Unified Field of Poetry.
There are a lot of very short one-liners.
There are a lot of one-liners that are great, that are funny. There's the Ars Poetica that I love. Yeah. That is that really kind of tender definition of poetry. And text is wilderness. And there's so much that happens in that. And so I think that there's some way that the wildness allows for meaning to occur and reoccur over time. And that it makes for a poem that is organic, that feels more alive in the voice, in the tongue, in the saying of it.
Well, you said before, and in the tongue, of course, I love the concept of in the tongue itself. In fact, one of my favorite bad jokes in one of my poems is going cold turkey or lukewarm tongue, which I've had a translator ask me, how do you translate that to very cold turkey or lukewarm tongue? But but that's very much in the tongue. It's a totally vernacular and conflicting joke, and that's so tongue. But you said before, saying and being. So there is something fundamental about the saying is the meaning. But what you've added, which I don't say, but I like very much, is and it's the being. The being is the saying, is the meaning. So when Keats writes "Season of Mist and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the adoring son, something like that, which I deform
Mm-hmm.
fruitlessness.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you hear of the full embodiedness, it's like Fort Da, here, not there. You also hear of the absence. For
Yes.
those who appreciate spring, they've gone through winter. And that
Mm-hmm.
seasonal movement, seasonal movement of there and not there is not emphasizing absence or even melancholy, you said, but I mean, I'm interested in grief and
Yes.
sorrow. Melancholy is something that is a somewhat different kind of thing, which,
That's true.
yeah. But I mean, not to be too Freudian about it. It's not that I'm not prone to melancholy or depression, but in terms of the poetics, I'm interested in this kind of toggling. Now, I guess we should go on to read the poem that we're going to do together. And we thought we'd do this in two voices. We're not
Okay.
giving you it on the screen. It's called Poetic Citizenship and Negative Dialectics. It's something I wrote for a symposium at the CUNY Graduate Center, your alma mater, organized by Q Lee. She asked me to do something. And so this concept of writing about poetic citizenship, is an interesting one, and one that's very much along my lines, although the responsibility as a citizen isn't the same as the responsibility of being a poet. So I'm going to read, this is all consisting of statements and then kind of contradictions in italic in a different voice. And Tanya has graciously agreed to read the italics, and I'm going to read the Roman. And she makes a cameo appearance herself in this essay. Poetry is best that governs least.
No, it isn't.
Poetry and citizenship are inconsolably incommensurable, conjoined at the heart, but beating time to different drummers.
From time to time.
Aesthetic justice is symbolic and dwells next to, not in, the world of political action.
Give me a break.
The politics of poetic form is averse to the form of political prose.
In your dreams.
The kind of poetry I want is precarious and extreme. The kind of citizenship I want is neither.
As if you can have it both ways.
Accessibility is to prose what opacity is to poetry.
As in, a long walk is better than a short pier?
The dollar value of poetry can be calculated as the square root of the sublime times the negative sum of utopia divided by the excess derivative of an originality.
You wish.
The kind of poetry I want questions norms of identity by rocking and roiling. It traffics in error and errancy. It's a querulous query, but that's not the only kind of poetry I want.
You could fool me, buddy.
When language grapples with the unfamiliar or repressed, it will more likely sound strange than familiar.
The strange is pretty familiar to me.
Politics speaks truth to power. Poetry speaks truth to truth.
Poetry is necessarily plural. Its strands are inimical to one another.
Poetry is just as vital when it is refused by public space as when it occupies public space. The question is not why discomforting poetry, to use a phrase of Tanya Foster's. The question is not why discomforting poetry doesn't have a public voice in America today, but why that voice is cast aside.
The question is not, is poetry dead again? But why are you dead to poetry?
Poetry is not an export product of suffering or beauty, solidarity or despair, but a domain of freedom shrouded in veils, an unextractable aesthetic core.
Poetry is a form of lamentation, not to split cares, an expression of lamentation.
Aesthetic justice turns an otherworldly eye to family, nation, community, rationality. Poetry, so conceived, is of the earth, not of the world. This is how poetry matters in the world.
Aesthetic privilege is a negative market force, an active agent of loss.
Poetry emerges from difficult life in spite of as much as much as a result of.
So much depends upon spite.
The promise of poems, the kind of poetry I want, is that it refuses reality.
But is it good for the Jews?
But is it good for the Jews? It's a good one. To be a poetic citizen is not to act as a citizen, but to perform as a poet. But there can be no citizenship without poetry. Even citizenship is symbolic. Citizenship that refuses dialogue with the delirious, wanton, discomforting possibilities of poetry approaches nativism.
Get off your low horse.
If citizenship is the first language of the Democrat, then poetry is a second language that, out of love and deep need, refuses to obey its mother tongue.
Poetry has no purpose, and that is not its purpose. Huh. When did you write this, Charles?
Well, it's probably written in the back. It's maybe like 4 years ago for the symposium.
Right. I'm just
Boy, I
thinking.
can hear birds. Got birds in your backyard?
So there are birds, and then they have this beautiful wind chime, and then I think I can kind of hear the BART train not far, and the birds are serious. Yes, they are.
You know, birds singing. What use value do they have? This is the old, go back to Keats.
Well, being is sufficient.
Right. But
yeah.
I mean, you said use value, and you're correct to say that my work is for meaning. And but in this kind of my line, my Kantian line, poetry has no purpose, which actually is repurposed from a poem that was in probably in recalculating or near miss. Poetry has no purpose, and that is not its purpose.
Right.
Of course, that's a paradox. You can't get outside of it, because there is what the value of the aesthetic is, but it's not, and there is a value in the aesthetic, and we both absolutely.
And there's a value in life in the sense that being is sufficient. So often the intention of turning the poem into a thing, or the purpose becomes the way of thingifying the poem, I think, and then it becomes an instrument, whether it's a tool of propaganda or tool of whatever. But what if it is merely an expression of being, and being is sufficient without these ways of turning us into things?
Right. And absolutely. And the danger of turning people into things, even if they're turning yourself. I actually, a lot of my critical thinking in this work, it's the most negatives about myself and my own thoughts. If it's something I actually can feel and see and abhors me and is abhorrent, I'm interested in it. If it's something I'm projecting onto somebody else, and there are many such things, it interests me less. I mean, maybe that's that joke, which was kind of disturbing in its own way. Is it good for the Jews? You know, that's an old Jewish joke. It's something happens, whatever it is. Right? Is it good for the Jews? It's a kind of a shtetl joke, but it could be applied to other groups too. The other side of what you're saying, that not to resist turning things, beings into things, which is an aesthetic space, and to me more important than sympathy or empathy even, because you don't have to have those feelings if you don't objectify or turn something into a thing. But it's the term I'm taking from you, which is discomfort. I say there's all kinds of dis words, right, that we use aesthetically, but you use the word discomfort, and that interests me quite a lot, because there's a lot of push for us poets to be comforting. If you read within popular culture, people say they want to read a poem that's comforting. And by the way, in this book, we're not talking about those poems here. There are many poems which
I'm looking at the moment. My computer may die, and so I'm trying to get on my other gizmo to take me to
your poem.
No. My computer may die. No, just
but you
so
have
we
your
can.
poem. Oh yes.
Yes.
Oh, your
Yes.
computer. Oh, your computer. You may lose your power.
Right, but so I just made it so I can access through another machine. Okay, got it.
And I'm looking at the time, and actually we're going to have to switch. I won't read the because I want you to read your poem, which we should go to now. But maybe you could just say
well, I'd like to say something about what you're saying, which I think is really important, and about grief, as opposed to melancholy. That there's space in our culture to grieve, and certainly over the last year, we've had an enormous amount to grieve, but we don't know how to, because the idea is that we're supposed to be comforted and okay all the time.
Yeah, well, that's why you're saying discomfort in that essay that I'm quoting, because I think that's a hard. For one thing, it's a hard thing when it's not meant to be strong medicine. It's not like castor oil. It's actually something else. It's comforting. It can be kind of smothering sometimes. It's not that we all need to be comforted sometimes, and we grieve and we're comforted and mourn, but nonetheless, the discomforting aspect is so crucial. Now, I think you had suggested I read a poem, which I'm not going to read. I'm just going to put it into the record. Two other poems, actually. One, the Procuring Poetry, which is a translation of Drummond. And if those folks get the book, you can imagine, like they say in Congress, let's put that into the conversation now. It's a wonderful poem in which he's saying something very much like this. Don't write comforting poems. Don't write poems that say how you feel. And it's all these don't. And you wonder what kind of poems
are you write?
And then the last stanza is very enigmatic, but it is something like, write the poem that says what it is. And the other poem that I'm not going to read now because of the time is called Freudian Slap. Freudian Slap.
I love that poem.
When I looked at that, I said, oh my God, there's a terrible typo. I must have meant Freudian Slip. So just a little small joke about that title. I made that mistake. But because we want to keep this to your poem and then go to the
Q&A
period, I think we should segue to your reading your poem After, which works so well with what we're talking about, I think.
Okay. So it is After, in progress. One march like the soldier through the sonic insistence of breath. Breathe in the minute, in the moment. Breathe, breathe. Body rest. Body rest away the rest, then breathe. Breathe. Body rest, body rested, body resting in as recline. Body rest, body rested by body politic is as decline. Body rest in each breath, in each breathe, in breathing. Body rests in each breath we take. Bodies rest in each breath taken by the body politic's restless decline. Body rest in the sonic soothing of your saying. Body rested from its resting in the sonic insistence of our isness, moved through by moving as an unmarshaled we. 2. But if I love you, what we are is of consequence each to the morning, each to the afternoon, and to the evenings retire. But if I love you, time is immeasurable and irrelevant. There is no easy accounting of the train's arrival, of the ship's docking. But if I love you, you are not drawn as an easy other conscripted in the agonies of marketed brands. Arrival and its possibility are verdant present joys. Leaving and its possibilities are expansive desert joys. But if I love you, you are not me, and we dance along our incongruous broken roadways. But if I love you, I will love many in the multiple that I am and that I love.
Well, it's a wonderful poem, a beautiful poem. And I love that you suggested this, because what I would hope for this, I'm not a big Zoom fan, and I'm especially not, I mean, I think there's wonderful work that goes, but I miss, seeing people in person, as I think most of us do. And I think in a lot of ways, Zoom or video conferences, create an enormous alienation from one another. It seems like I'm here, but really, of course, I'm not. And so I always feel a sense of loss when I leave my favorite such events, because I was there, but I wasn't there. And
Right.
I was thinking the two of us talking would work better. It's the conversation that I miss. And this poem seems to me in incredible, a fabulous conversation with what we have been together talking about throughout this last 40 minutes or so. And so many of the things that we've talked about get echoed. I mean, certainly not a poem. It's a very different point of view, different form and so on, but it echoes, my favorite word of late, echo poetics, a lot of those things. And so sonic soothing of your saying is, for one thing, it's just, again, like thinking with the Keats line, season of mists and fellow, it's all of those vowels opening up and bouncing off. And you got a lot of that vowel music in all your work, but it has a different rhythm, of course, very different, and importantly different than Keats, great as Keats is. It's not that kind of rhythm. It comes from a different place. It's where a song might come in. But sonic soothing, just the O's in that is so great. Sonic soothing of your saying. And then, of course, the S's, the three sibilants, sonic soothing saying. And it speaks to this issue of soothing, comforting, but also kind of dissonance, which you have with your rested, W-R-E-S-T, and resting. Rested and resting is also sort of to the heart of it. And then you say sonic insistence of our isness. There, the I-S in insistence becomes the isness, insistence, isness. I love that kind of wordplay or punning where the isness becomes. I also love this unmarshaled we. That's something that is to my heart. An unmarshaled we. Sometimes we need marshaled we's, and we surely do in this US of A. We have to marshal ourselves as a we. But sometimes we also have to find something else, which is an unmarshaled we, which allows us to reconfigure. Dance, the incongruous and the broken is another thing in that. And then what I wrote you back yesterday in the text message sort of really brought it home. But if I love you, time is immeasurable and irrelevant. There is no easy accounting of the train's arrival or the ship's docking. So that's your topsy-turvy moment, docking, arrival, and then flipping that around. So I thank you so much for doing that.
Well,
Reading
thank you.
that poem.
Conversation with you. I mean, I always enjoy conversations, and I'm really old school. So if you know me, I'm on the phone with you.
Right. That's true.
Otherwise, it's true. Only if I know, like, they're the friends I talk to, and you're one of those people for me.
Yeah, so we talk on the phone, not video. I don't like video so much. We talk on the telephone for sometimes a long time, musing about politics and other kinds of things. Now, Eric said by this time we should turn it back over to our moderators. And I'm maybe a couple of minutes late, but I think we're all right with time, right, Eric?
You are perfect with time. You're a time master. Thank you both so much. This is an incredible conversation and such a reminder of how poetry speaks to the moment, to the present every time. It gets right in there. I'm so moved by that. And I want to bring to you a question that I think really kind of pierces that, just the thread the two of you were weaving in this recent portion. Someone noting that, Charles, your magic trick is writing uncomfortable poems without ever being dour.
Dour, that's a really, I don't use the word
true.
dour, but I think that is, yeah, you say the comic, and I said I can actually be melancholy, it's true, but dour, not. Yeah.
No.
And kind of building off what Tanya was getting at, what I mean, our questioner is asking, is it possible that dourness is somehow comforting to people? Like, why is dourness what we expect?
For one thing, I would always say, just as a matter of really principle, it's not that there couldn't be a great poem that was dour, of course, and there are wonderful works of literature that are dour. It is true that I that's not what I do, so I'm not against it. Dour, if it's compulsory dourness, which is a different thing. People feel they need to be dour, I think, not even in poems, to show to wear their heart on their sleeves, as it used to be said, which again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a way of indicating that you take seriously something that's a problem, and it's a kind of mark of high seriousness. And that certainly dominated an aspect of American poetry, not one related to what the American poetry that I see, going back to Poe and so on, or I think from the fair amount I know about what engages Tanya as a poet, that this tradition is not related to either of those, what we're engaged with so much, but dourness is a mark of a kind of high seriousness, which is put forward by the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books. I mean, that's the mark that this is not trivial and ludicrous, and so that's the problem. It isn't that you couldn't be dour. Now I'm inspired to write a dour poem, but if I write it, I'm afraid it would be comic. Obviously, I have an interest in the comic, so it's hard to take a question like that without.
I also feel like I'm laughing to keep from dying. That to me is it's the blues song. You take the sorrow and make it swing. Yeah. And you don't make it swing because you're making light of it. You make it swing because you're still alive.
Yeah. I mean, if Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. I always think of that. And, or don't mourn. I mean, the comic element really, and I think I could say in these last three books, Recalculating, Near Miss, and this one, there's plenty of bad things that happen to everybody. And I try to acknowledge, personally bad and also terrible political things that go on. But that's not a cause, as Tanya is saying, not to be comic. The comic allows one not to become, so fixed in one's ways, and to rethink what the terms are, and so on. and to understand in myself, and I'm not talking about anybody else, in myself, I'm both the problem and the response to that problem. It's hard to see. I'm not every problem in the world, because there are some which really are so monstrous, including the Republican Party, which are beyond my imagination. But there are most of the problems in the world that I see are things that I can, there, but for the grace of poetry or the comedy, or indeed even of God, go I. I'm interested in being the chief problem that I confront in my work. Because I also dislike condescension. It's hard to avoid it, but I have no justification for it anyway, so I'm aware of that. So the dourness tends to be a kind of moral seriousness, which can be smug, and that's not something that that's something that seems to me a problem. Oh, Tanya was saying she was having a problem with her.
Tanya's buffering.
Hi.
It's like on the scene in Oakland.
Okay,
Well,
I'm
let's
on
see
the
if
mobile.
we connect.
It's those
There. Wow, I love that.
multiple
was a
realities
highlight.
she was alluding to.
I would have planned that, and I'm not telling you that we didn't plan that.
Okay, although I can't hear.
Well, that's
Okay,
That's our
now I
next-
can.
yo, beautiful.
I love the going out and then coming back. I mean, that's the fourth dot. In Freud, there's the there, not there, which the plays with the ball, and I love that in the Zoom. You see that? Even Tanya, for a second, going off and on, takes away some of the society, the spectacle of the video to me, because we see that this person is on a technology. They're juggling things. So this was a long answer to the question about dourness, but
well, it's a good one.
I should have answered it in a more dour way.
Thank you for not doing that.
And I'm drinking water, by the way. This is water, in case anybody
sparkling water. Mine
thinks
is
it's beer.
Drink it up.
Mine
I don't
is
drink
100%.
beer.
Yeah, this is sadly water, but it's shortly after I'm gonna convert.
Now, Tanya's wonderful disappearance and reappearance, and Charles, your comment on it actually leads toward another question. Someone who was enjoying the mistake, the Freudian slap of fruitfulness for fruitlessness, and asked, was it prearranged or your topsy-turvy mind ad-libeled? Very nicely done.
I have, there's a line in that, the study casualness or the casual steadiness. I mean, I have to be honest with you here, Eric. It's like in a television interview. Is it real or did you make that up? Right. It is true that I make a lot of errors and slips. I have to be honest, I do. And I can't tell myself. But in that particular case, and I did it also in one of the poems, I flipped one word. I said core when it was a different word. In that case, I just simply remember the original line because of the echo. And for me, it's very indicative of constantly hearing doubles of things. Right. So I did not make that. However, the joke about making a mistake with the title of the Freudian slap, my comedy team, we met for a couple of weeks, and that was worked out. That was well in advance. Yeah.
Good. Well, the Netflix series is coming. The form of Errata.
Or the movie, you were saying the movie.
The Broadway musical.
Broadway musical, excuse me. Broadway musical.
The form of Errata, someone wants to know if it might have been inspired by Sean Bonney, who has the wonderful poem that begins, "For I love you, say fuck the police." And you have a poem about Sean Bonney.
There's a poem in here, which is a very, very, talk about grief. There's a couple of elegies, one of them for the wonderful poet Sean Bonney. Yeah, I mean, Sean, errata slips is something that goes back in my work for a long time. And it's a lot like, slipping on a banana. And it's also something that I'm constantly dealing with, correction of mistakes that I don't want. So I make a lot of spelling errors and other kinds of errors that are not intentional, that I don't want to be in the books. And I rely upon other people, especially Susan B., who's a incredibly good speller and doesn't make the kind of mistakes I make. And she's always asking me that question. She always says to me, "Do you mean this mistake? And if you do, please don't use it." She always wants to just be sure and be sure that it's, and questions whether it really would hold up too. So, Sean Bonney and Errata is very powerful. The Errata, there's a Louis Zukowski and Errata every time of year, Errata and year and ear. Ear and Errata is so interesting. Sean has a kind of an edge to it and a political militance that's visionary around this question. And I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear what I'm doing echoing with Sean Bonney. He died, young, and he's one of the really great British poets, or I don't know why I don't like to put it that way. One of the great poets of this time, and certainly English language poets.
Wonderful. Last question. Someone sensing that Topsy-Turvy might be the conclusion of a trilogy that sort of started with recalculating and goes through near miss. Do you see it that way?
Yes, I do. I think that the three are I mean, somebody asked, what does that mean? It sounds kind of annoying in a certain way to talk about a trilogy, but nonetheless, in my experience, I see these three books as linked. There are many similar themes and concerns and time and deaths that are brought to mind in it. I mean, the other thing to talk about is late work. This goes back to Tanya's question. Now that I'm 71. When you were 24, you wrote this poem. What's the connection? I mean, it's so interesting because there's so much discontinuity. But I'll tell you one thing. In 1968, when I turned 18, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated on my 18th birthday. That was a dark time. And civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the issue with asylums and so I don't want to just give a list of that. I mean, things have often been dark. Darkness is not political darkness is not a new thing. It has a new and ugly torque, and I think right now we see a willingness of a large part of the population to say things which were always implied, but sometimes not made as explicit as they are now, and that's scary to me. Because it's more like the Nazis, which were not good for the Jews, by the way. And, so it's you see, now why is that funny? Why don't I bring it in that way? Because the consciousness is tripled and so, but nonetheless, these three books are late. They're late works and they're rethinkings, and they're all with echo and echo poetics, with song, with elegy, and a certain kind of variety and certain tones that are different. That I don't know what I'm going to do next, but the next thing I do won't be like these three books.
Well, that seems like the perfect note to end on, because that is exciting. Thank you both for joining us to celebrate this. Tanya, thank you for reading that beautiful poem. That has whetted our appetite even further for your next book. And to all our viewers out there, thank you for joining us and celebrating with us. It's been great to have you here. Coming up the next few weeks, we have Adrian Matika next week, and the week after that, Nathaniel Mackey. So I hope you'll come back and celebrate even more terrific poetry with us. Until then, stay safe, everyone. Thanks again, and good night.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Good night.